right, hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. We're your hosts this evening. I am Tobias, and this is Will. Together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are all perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. Curiosity Club is made merrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon. And now let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Colt Bowden of Sign Painting.
Hello. Am I on? Hopefully I am. Okay, I'm Colt Bowden. I am a sign painter, and the history of sign painting and the ghosts of sign painters that live among us. So let us all arise. We're going to go on a walk. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit more as we walk, but we're just going to take a quick walk around the block and then come back and do a slide presentation.
definitely. So, here, I'm gonna leave them unplugged until these people get back.
Where did everybody go?
They're taking a walk. The presentation's on signs, and so they're walking around the neighborhood looking at a few signs, and then they'll be back for the rest of the presentation. So, they're out very close
Am
by.
I missing a lot?
I don't know what's going on out there, so, and I wouldn't know exactly where to tell you to go.
My
So.
girlfriend told me to come this night.
Yeah, well,
Because we were gonna do this together. but-
would you like a beer? They'll be back in just a couple minutes. Yeah, they're just.
Don't drink.
Okay. Do we have any besides beer?
I think we meant to buy some but I don't think we did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they've been gone maybe 10 minutes, so, you know, like you're saying,
I
waiting
went
walls.
out to, I went like that when I went that way. No idea where they went, so I don't know.
Oh, wow, that's okay. Well, my girlfriend must be over on that walk because
Yep.
she's not responding to my text.
Give the tour. Too busy taking in the signs.
Because otherwise I would have had to go to my car, then come here, and then I would have missed most of it. So what's the point? So since I work from my bus just dropped off down there, and so I was taking the bus, and I'm like, Broadway, it's right here.
Yeah.
So I just got off the bus and I walked here.
Good deal. This is your first time.
Sorry?
Your first time at a Curiosity Club.
Yes, I've never been.
Yes.
See, my friend Pascal, she always finds things like that.
Yeah. Cool.
That's good because I'm too busy to look for things like that. So I'm really hot and I
Yeah,
like my
please, have a
uniform
seat,
is
yeah.
like everybody's got
So I still have those on plug.
Oh,
I figured if that was, you know, lessening the load or reducing the heat or something, we might as well just leave them unplugged until everything shifts back up. Give it as long as we can. So, and when they get back, it's gonna take them to find their seat and stuff. During that time, we're trying to Hey, we've done this for many weeks. And so, the back. So I started thinking it has to do with heat. Taking my notes for the top.
Are we all back in here? Okay, so one of the first sign painting books I ever bought when I was, this was a reprint. So this one, 1909, and then this was reprinted in 1915. And in this book, it contained just the basics of how to paint signs and all the formulas for mixing paint, because you had to mix your own paint back in 1909. And it also had examples of other sign painters from around the country. So up on the slide, we've got a sign here. This has been fully recolored. All the signs that he showed in this book were in black and white, of course, but he gave the descriptions of what colors it should be. And so here we go. Sign. I just want to, let's see, I want to double check, make sure that's the right address. Okay, so that's the wrong address. Here's the original, 209 Alder Street. Southwest is to be decided. I looked up both, and is it right now? There, by Olympic, which was taken in March, so it's probably still pretty defunct looking. Anyways, so Fred, we don't know much about Fred. Really all we know is that he had a picture in this sign painting book, and he was a sign painter from Portland, Oregon. But that speaks volumes that, you know, the Atkinson book, this was made in Chicago, which was like the center point of sign painting in the turn of the century in 1909. And to have sign examples from Portland must have spoke that, hey, they had something classy going on out there. We've got roses, so we know it's very pertinent to Portland. Here's some other examples of things that were relevant. Let's see. Ed Mills, Portland, Oregon, made this one. Willard Clark. So these are just some examples of signs made by people from Portland. We know nothing about these people. For some reason, there's no history on them. But they were pretty dang fancy, and I'd love to see pictures of Portland where these signs were out and hanging. So to get to anybody that we know, I have to jump ahead. So, because I don't know anybody from 1909, and I don't know any other sign painters that knew sign painters from 1909. So what I'm going to do is jump ahead to the oldest sign painter I know. I was talking to you guys about him, and his name's Nate Pendleton, and he lives out by where I'm at in McMinnville, and he worked for a company called Ramsey Signs. And so Ramsey Signs, sorry, these are really small pictures. They started in 1911, I believe, as a sign manufacturer, and in 1911 onward towards World War I, World War II, they started to be the first people incorporating neon signs and also like lit signs. Before neon, they would cut out little holes and put light bulbs in their signs. And Ramsey Signs, I believe they're responsible for like the Portland state with the deer jumping, that kind of sign. And so they did all these signs, and Nate, he worked for them. And Nate, he's a great guy. I don't have a picture of him with me right now, but he's 83, he's got long hair, and he's just, he always went against the grain. He worked for these guys. He moved here in 1967, and he'd work for them, and he'd do work, and then he'd go home on the weekends, and he'd do more sign painting. They called those snap jobs, and sometimes he'd get in trouble. And one time he told me this story where he was out snapping a job. He had to paint this billboard, and he was driving the company truck, and he's driving it, and he's painting it at night, so he's got this lantern going. And sign painters, I don't know if you know this or not, but we paint with all oil-based paints for the most part, and we use a lot of mineral spirits or gasoline, things that are very flammable. So at some point, his lantern fell over and it lit the truck on fire. And he's out there snapping a job, which is against company policy because they're just supposed to work for, just the company. And so as Nate tells it, he puts out the fire. He's missing all of his hair on his arms and his eyebrows and a good portion of his hair. And somehow he repaints the truck, all the places where it was burned, and paints all night, re-letters it and everything, and gets it back into the shop in the morning, and nobody asks a question. And if you ever get to talk to Nate, those are the kind of stories you'll hear. Good, he'll just talk your ear off. I called him up this morning just for some extra stories, and I was like, okay, I just need 5 minutes of your time to follow up on a couple questions I had, and half an hour later, he's still talking. So the other thing he said that was when they would work for Ramsey Signs, Ramsey was growing and growing and growing, and they started like swallowing up other sign shops. So they would just buy them out, incorporate them in. And if you know the pizza shop right across from Powell Books, that little like corner shop location, that's one of their locations. He said that's where he worked when he worked for them. And when he was, I think it might have been before he was working for them, they would send people over to the shipyards to work on the ships, and they had like a work trade thing where they'd work 3 days for the ships and work 3 days painting signs, or 2 days painting signs. And he said they were the first people to paint to letter on airplanes for United Airlines, which was out on Sophie Island, which is pretty interesting. And they had a lot of competitors. Oregon Signs was their competitor. So when we went out and looked at that sign, it said Oregon Sign Company. That was one of his competitors for the big wall jobs. And Pacific Signs was another sign company that did a bunch of wall signs. And he said that they had a union. And I talked to another sign painter today, and he mentioned the union lightly. He said there was a sign painters union, and eventually, like by the 70s and 80s, it got just incorporated with the painters and varnishers, like the painting and decorating union, and so he said it was very ineffective. There's a book called Sign Painters Don't Read Signs. I don't know if any of you have ever heard about this. And it was written by a guy named Cy Earle, and somehow I got a signed copy. I don't think he's still alive, but when I found this copy, it was signed. And he was from Portland, and this entire book, if you guys really want to get a picture of sign painting in Portland from the 40s to about the mid-60s, that's what his entire book is about, his career and his experience as a sign painter here in Portland. Don't go too much farther into looking around in his life because he was kind of a racist dude, but that goes for a lot of people in the mid-century. But anyways, good resource. Okay, so the other person that kind of connects between Nate Pendleton and Cy Earle was a man named Roy Darby. And Roy Darby is my connection to the past of sign painting. And I don't know if any of you have seen, there is a, let's see.
Oh, yeah.
There's a billboard. Yeah, this is the old one. So darn tootin', I use Darby's. This is called Darby's Reducer. And there's a sign painting supply store that sells Darby's Reducer, and Darby's famous partly because of this reducer, and they painted this, I believe, after he passed away. And it's basically, reducer is what you put in the paint to make it thin so it's really workable to paint signs with. And his reducer was, you'd take like all the other thinners and additives and you just pour them all in one, and that was his reducer. At least that's what it smells like, because they still sell it over at Pacific Coast Sign Supply. And so Roy Darby was a sign painter from the 40s up until about the 80s when he passed away. And he helped to bring in the younger generation of sign painters, and he was kind of the connection between the older sign painters and the younger sign painters. So my connection to him is, there's a man named Lee Littlewood and Pete McKernan, and they share a sign shop out on Foster Road off of the freeway, the 205 out there, and they worked with him because they've been painting signs here since like the 70s, and they worked with him, and their shop is full of a lot of his stuff, like his swing stage and his old supplies. So it was great. I was able to go over there, and they have like all of his old photos, and this is just an example of his letterhead right here. Roy Darby Signs. That's not his letterhead. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to go through and just show these pictures from Roy Darby's life, because a lot of them are relevant to, they're just really interesting to look at. And when I was talking to Nate Pendleton, he mentioned a lot of people that Roy worked with. He knew Roy, and Nate, he's kind of a cocky dude, and he's like, Roy is just kind of like, he was like just a middle ground sign painter. But Nate was older than Roy, so that gives you a picture of where that comes from. So this right here, this really tall thing on the left, that's called a swing stage. And that's what they would hang. They'd either put that on top of some ladders up against a wall so you'd get high, or they'd drop it down from the top of the building. And this was Roy Darby's actual swing stage. So you can see Roy Darby signs, the Silver Fox, and then this one says Lee's Better Letters. So that was Lee Littlewood's swing stage. And my easel that I paint on was from their sign shop too. They gave me one. So I'm just going to go through and talk about sign painting. These are all photos from old jobs that Roy Darby either did or took photos of. So when you're in the sign painting culture, everybody's friends, and so anyways. So if any of you guys want to stop when we're on one of these and ask it, or if you want to ask any questions, I can kind of open it up for that. But these were just traditional truck lettering signs. Yeah.
So you showed us his letterhead. It did single out trucks. Is that mainly like what you painted?
So cloth or banner, cloth or banner papers up on the right-hand side, truck lettering. Yeah, he did a lot of truck lettering.
Yeah, I mean for that to be singled out.
Yeah, that was, so the reason why is mostly because he had a shop where you could drive a truck into it. And that was, that was the biggest deal. If you had a shop where you could drive a truck in, then you could do truck lettering. So auto and truck painting, fleets, commercial buses, all of these were done just scratch layouts, which means you would take a little wax pencil or like a grease pencil and you would draw lines and you would draw out your lettering and then you would paint it right on the door. And then you'd turn around to do the same thing for the other door on the other side of the truck. Sometimes they'd give you a business card and you'd say, okay, just replicate this. So you'd just draw it by hand. And they would use the, oh yeah, you can see the front of his shop right up there. Darby's, Roy Darby, truck lettering signs, metal, wood, paper, or glass. Superior Painters. This one's a really old one. This was before Roy's time, I believe. He had some, they've got all of his, Lee and Pete, they've got all of his old photos, so let me look through them and take pictures of them to show you guys. But they've got some really, really classic old ones. Here's like a...
From your collection or the Oregon Historical Society?
These are from Pete McKernan and Lee Littlewood's collection. So this was Roy Darby's personal photo album. They just have a box of photo albums, and these were all in there. And they gave these to Lee and Pete to share with the other sign painters. Let's see, there's Roy right there, 1963. If you saw my truck out front, it's a 1963 truck, and there he is on one of those. That's not even a swing stage, that's just like a 2x12. All right, there we go. There's a swing stage, some sign painters in action. So Roy was great. He made his own swing stages. He constructed these little things to hang down from the tops of buildings, and you'll see a couple pictures. I don't know exactly where this is. Some of you might recognize this corner, but it was just great. They would paint the craziest signs on buildings.
Like the B&O building, where Olympic Provisions is now.
Yeah? Oh yeah, that totally could be.
The water tower and everything on it.
Yep, that very well could be. Coast to coast stores. Yeah, that would.
Yeah, it is, because there's Morrison Bridge.
Okay, perfect. We were wondering where that was. Okay. So you guys are probably going to get a lot more out of this than I am, because you're very familiar with Portland. I live in McMinnville, so I am not as familiar with Portland. I don't know where this building is. I think there was a note on this that they painted this with 3 people in 2 days, or 2 people in 3 days, one or the other. It's like a 120-foot long sign. Sorry, it's vertical. Oh, there they are painting it right there. I wouldn't be surprised if 1 or 2 of these signs somewhere out there exist or are showing through somewhere.
64 flats.
You can even see up above this sign, there's a ghost sign above that showing through. This was probably, the 60s right here? I don't even know how to say that. All right. So you see a little signature down here, security signs. I think he worked for security signs at one point. Security signs is still around, and you'll see that signature a couple more times. There's another truck out in front of Roy's shop. Man, these trucks are so beautiful. Portland Fish Company. Distinctive painted signs. 1950. That's so great. Cleaning solvent. Just what you want to clean with, right? Kerosene. Now, sadly, I couldn't get Lee Littlewood out here. He was the most direct connection with Roy Darby, but he's out in Boston visiting his grandkids right now. He could probably tell you more about this.
I met Roy Darby in 1984.
Okay.
We started a sign business in '84 in town.
Okay.
And we used to go to meetings at Lee and
I'm going to turn the time over to somebody who.
Well, my wife and I started a sign business in Portland in '84, and we used to go to meetings at Lee and Pete's shop. Lee and Pete used to call it the sign commune, because they had a shop with some indoor space, and a lot of sign guys would use their space when they needed to letter trucks and that. Still that way. I haven't been to their new shop. But there used to be a group called the Graphic Arts Group, or GAG for short, and we used to meet at Lee and Pete's place. And when I first met Roy Darby, he was expounding on how he thought everybody needed to serve an apprenticeship. And I looked at him, and because when we started in '84, we didn't know anything about signs. We just jumped in. And I told Lee, I says, basically, the hell with the apprenticeship, I got to make the mortgage payment. And so through our friends in the sign business and different suppliers and that, we got started, and they helped us along. It was very cool.
What's your name?
Ed LaPlante.
Thank you, Ed. Upon this picture, I was talking to Nate this morning, and he mentioned this guy Cap. And Cap, what did he say about Cap? So he mentioned Cap and said that he was a world-renowned archer, and that he actually shot with Fred Bear, who's very famous in the archer world. I grew up in an archery house, so that's why that was relevant to me. You just look at these simple layouts, and they're so beautiful. And you look at it, and you're like, wait a second. They were doing these before computers and before you could project it on. I mean, they might have had a projector, but most likely they would have just laid it right on the side of the truck there and just painted it.
Bob Fulton, the guy whose name's on that, was the guy that started Security Signs. And he,
There you go.
He's still around, and he's doing really cool art. He does these fence toppers that are round globes with very ornate painting on them.
So he said that Bob Fulton is still around. He started Security Sign Company. That's good to know.
When they're working on trucks as opposed to like signs and buildings, like are they, they're like sketching it out somehow first, right?
Yeah. So they usually use a pencil called a stabilo. So this is a little stabilo. You can find them at any art store that is of note, or any sign supply store that is also of note. And it's just a grease pencil, essentially, a water-soluble pencil, and you just draw it on there, and then you use chalk, but that scratches the paint sometimes. So still use it today. Stabilos.
Would you use that on like if you're not doing a sign, but like some other kind of artwork too, like on different materials?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a temporary layout tool. So a lot of times we'll use it in front of the glass and then paint the sign on the back. I don't know who Dick was, but it's great to see a man with a tie on and a suit jacket and a canful of paint, just painting them. Looks like the side of either a roll-down door or a semi-truck. How much like that? 51, never repainted.
Yeah.
Yep. Most sign painters before the digital age learned from other sign painters. And they were taught, they knew nothing about type, because type and typography was setting type into letterpresses or, typing it on a linotype machine. Opposite spectrum, because they would learn how to letter is more like calligraphy. Brush lettering and hand lettering were taught, and so you'd learn the basic block letters and you'd learn script. And in the 60s, casual lettering, which is more of like a fun, playful type of lettering, started to appear, and so it was like a handed down trade. So the books, there were people that would put out books. This was the Atkinson book. This came out, and this was like a how-to book. There was a book that you could get called the International Correspondence School, and they would send you a book, and they would send you like assignments. and you'd have to do it and mail back your work, and then they'd grade you. And I've actually met a couple sign painters who did it that way. That was still around back in the day, and they're perfectly good sign painters. You know, it's all just learning the techniques. When I started sign painting, I picked up a book called The Sign Painting Course, and I found it, I don't remember if I found it online or if I found it in an old bookstore. It was written by E.C. Matthews, and he was a prominent sign painter out of Chicago, St. Louis area. And he, just like Atkinson, wrote a book, showed pictures, cataloged pictures of other sign painters, and made those available. And he'd send out a book. Sometimes they were thinner pamphlets. He'd send them out, $5 plus post. And you could learn how to paint signs. And that's when I first got into sign painting. I didn't know any other sign painters. I grew up in Utah, and where I was, there was nobody doing it. And I was actually studying typography. I was working for a letterpress guy, and he would pallet out all of his ink into old phone books. And I was looking through one of the old phone books, and they were out of date. And there was a guy in there from Price, Utah, which was like the middle of nowhere between Salt Lake and the middle of Utah and old coal mining town. And it said his name, hand lettering. So I called it up. His wife answered. He's like, "How'd you get this number? He hasn't been doing this for a couple years." And so I went down, I met him, because it was on the way down to my grandparents' house, and he showed me the ropes. That was the first time I ever met like a real sign painter and saw hand lettering. And that's really how you learn it. You have to see somebody else do it properly to like learn. But people have been doing sign painting and sign writing for hundreds of simple one. Then we jump to the age of color, start getting into some of these color ones, 60s and 70s, and it starts to look like a Draplin design everywhere. I got a kick out of these. Children's shoes. So that down below where it says children's shoes are only business, that's a casual kind of lettering style, and that wasn't really popular until the 60s. It wasn't really around until maybe the 50s, 40s and 50s started showing up.
It looks pretty derived from like newspaper comics era.
Well, that's where newspaper. I mean, it was just the easiest way to write capital lettering with a brush. That's a lot of ladder. And then there's a ladder to get up to the ladder. So back in the day, billboards were painted by hand. And this is how you painted billboards if they were in place, like up on top of a building or on a freeway and hadn't been installed yet. Otherwise, they'd paint billboards in a big building. Out in McMinnville, where I live, there's a guy named Rod Axtell. And if you're ever out in McMinnville, you'll see a ton of his signs. And he got started in the 1960s down in Los Angeles painting billboards. And they would do full pictorial billboards, like full color advertisements. And then he moved up to Oregon and he just did regular painting billboards. So this is, I don't know where this is now, but Jansen. Looks like they did a whole job to do. No, sometimes corporate would give you I mean, even today, yeah, they'd give. Yep. Special cut.
You don't happen to have any of those books, do you?
Yeah, there's another.
Get it in, get it out, do it on the weekend.
I mean, that's 8 foot plus another 8 feet, and they've just got one board going across that top one.
No harnesses.
And then you got to use that to get it. I don't even know how you get up to the very top, like that top platform. That's just where I draw the line.
It's kind of a piece of installation art in itself. This is what it says about like relationship.
You see this fella down here? No hard hat in sight, no strap in sight, no nothing. PGW. Yeah. If you see a photograph of him painting, he will guaranteed have one of those, and that's to keep your hand off the paint and also to steady your hand. There.
That's pretty designy too, actually.
Yeah, that's probably a Dairy Queen ad they just gave them and said, okay, we want this 8 foot tall by 24 feet wide. So here you go. Here's Morgan Signs. I don't know what the first name was, but this was a big sign company. This is just a sign install, but still, there's his little Roy. Not sure. Yeah, it's. There you go. Bring the sun along, have him pose. Jim Sanders, painting ink. Now, a lot of times people will say, hey, I want that old look. And you think, okay, well, it's got to have like rough edges and be kind of shaky, but au contraire, or however you say that in French. All the old sign painters that I know say, no, we painted signs perfect back in the day. And you look at this lettering, and it is just as crisp as can be, and that script is like, you know, it's so good. You might mess with the kerning a little bit here and there, but the edges, and it was, you know, it looks like it could have been a sticker. That Christensen. Man, I think that's my same truck right there. Yeah, there's another one of those OSHA-approved scaffolds. just got to stand up there and paint it. Oh yeah, you can see right here. See these lines on the bottom and the top of the letter? They would just snap a line and then get a yardstick out, draw it out.
He's just putting white
Yeah,
all around.
yeah, he's just doing the border, but there's like a little white line that goes along the whole baseline.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So they had just snapped a line. Here's the top, here's the bottom.
I wonder what those citizens were for.
Democrats
And Republicans. There you go.
We're equal.
Printing company, ads for your business. Was this Roy right here? I don't think that looks. Are they hanging a noose from there? That must have been for the paint can. So you could raise it up. Oh, there's a great one.
Yeah, look at how hard it is painting over these ripples.
Oh, and you can't even tell they're there in the letters. That's just perfect. And you notice he's got like a 3 or 4 inch brush. Just zipping along. Holbrook Lumber Company. And that's probably all he brought, was that ladder and that car. Oh, I've just got a quick job. There's a good one. Kenny Irk, June 1981. So this is his invention of like how it was hooked on to the firewall up there. A little look at that scaffold. All right, now where do you put your hands and where do you put your feet to get out on there from the rooftop? Just painting Fred Meyer. Oh, and it was rolling. See these wheels up here? That way they wouldn't have to set it up. So they had wheels against the building and wheels up top. Just make sure your wheels are clean. And they just roll along, and they're all adjustable in case there's windows. Larry Graham, he looks like he's doing windows or something. Yeah, he's a window splasher. So when you see these colorful windows painted, there's a guy, he dresses up like a clown and paints really, really good windows, and there's a couple other people. And these people paint fast. That's why they have so much paint all over them. The window splashers. Andy. Hokey's Pizza House. I think that's Roy right there. Young Roy. Just Grand Electric. Line them up. They probably brought them all in at the same time to a shop and lettered them all in like 3 or 4 days. I wish this was in focus. That was the coolest billboard. Oh yeah, there we go. There's the roller. Just rolling it out. I don't know what the ladders are tied to. or why that scaffolding's leaning against the building. So as you're driving around Portland and you see one of these little old signs peeking out, I made a little hashtag, just Portland ghost signs, and you should take a picture and post it on there. That's what I'm thinking. I want to start collecting them and make kind of a visual map of Portland, all the old signs that people see, and whether they're still readable or barely readable. These are the people that were painting them, you know, from the 50s up until now. And when you see those old signs, just imagine this little guy on his non-OSHA approved ladder painting little characters.
Those guys are still there. They're still there.
Exotic specialties.
They're next to Pacific Coast Sign.
Okay. So there's a science supply store over off 7th and Salmon, right next to the post office over there, and these guys are still there, Exhaust Specialties. Look at that. Man.
They still have the same character too?
Maybe.
No.
Maybe not. Okay.
But the letter style is the same.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
Exhaust Specialties, it's the same.
Should-
And they need new signs.
We should bring it back.
That's the blue and yellow.
There you go, 700 Southeast Belmont. Man, you imagine a whole fleet of Volkswagen buses.
Do you know what year those are painted? Is that, if you go back, that one on the left is this, oh, we can then go
Wait.
one forward. So the one on the left is a 63.
Okay, well those look brand new. I mean,
The one on the right is between a 59 and a 62.
so it very well could have been 63, 64, 65, somewhere around there. Hard to say because they didn't have the date on these slides that I could see. This is July 64, so it was probably around 64. This was like the very next slide. Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. 64, it says right there. That's great. Good year for sign painting. We get green stamps. Oh, this was my favorite. Taka House. Wait. And that's to say adios. So that's the end of my presentation right there.
Taco House is still around too.
Yeah. So 82nd Avenue, 1 block south of Fremont.
But that's the one that was on McLaughlin.
Okay. Southeast McLaughlin, just north of Colgate. Gotcha. That's so great. I don't think that little dude would fly anymore. Probably be a little more heavy. Well, that's my presentation. Do you guys have any questions?
So with all the OSHA-approved scaffolding, were there any stories of mishaps?
I'm sure there were. I'm trying to think. You know, sadly, the guy that sold me, so in Salt Lake, this isn't a Portland story, but in Salt Lake City, the guy that sold me a bunch of sign equipment, I tried to get a hold of him like last year or the year before. And I'd met him about 5 years ago. He sold me some stuff like an easel and a little electric pattern making machine. And he was up in like a little truck bucket, and it malfunctioned, and he fell out. Not to dwell on those.
Yeah, how long does it take until you learn a really good sense of balance on those scaffoldings?
It seems to be that you immediately have it, and the longer you do it, the less and less you have. Painting a sign that we had, it was like a wall for a garage at the end, and it just went for 120 feet. And so we had to walk on scaffolding all week long, but it wasn't scary. It was just, you know, you were on there. And at one point I was walking, and I'm kind of tall, and I hit the top of my head on one of the low parts of the scaffolding. And by the end of that day, and I was just having the worst time. And I get home, I fly home, and to find out that I got a concussion from it. So even when you're just walking, you can get hurt.
Do you have examples of your own work?
Sure. I've got a, let's see, I'll just pull up my website. Yeah, sign might have looked like. And they're the only people that I can find that had big brick cigar signs. There was there was a lot of chewing tobacco signs, but I think Owl was like that was their big ad campaign, was doing brick. So let's see, here's a fun one. I did this out in Manhattan, me and my sign painting partner Mitch, who couldn't join us tonight. So this was like an interior job, and it's kind of hard to see. So it was a Coney Island themed job. It was in Manhattan, and we pulled a lot of resources from old pictures of Coney Island, and then we went down to Coney Island and looked at it, and we painted this whole interior mural sign. That was kind of fun.
What was this being used for?
This is just a conference room. It's for a tech company owned by eBay and PayPal, and it was just their little conference room. This is here you go. Here's a glass sign I did for a fella out in Springville, Utah. He makes hats, real beaver hats. So this was a double-sided glass sign. I had to paint 2 of these, well, gild 2 of these. And so when you put gold on glass, it's called gilding, and when you put paint on, it's just called painting. But we used a lot of different carrots, and that was fun. Here you go, Max Sign Painting. Show you some of me and Mitch's work. Here's my truck door. I have a 1963 Ford truck, and so I wanted to paint it like those. But this is up in the Kenton district. We did this with a blue ox tattoo. That was a fun window. We did that one last year.
Nice color in there. Yeah. Impressive.
So you see the backside, it's a little kind of transparent looking. That was a really fun one. So that was gold leaf in paint. All drawn out by hand and designed by hand, no computers used at all.
What's the majority of your work now? Windows?
You know, I'm a everything man. So I've got windows at first because those are always the prettiest to show. But I'll do big wall signs and little window signs. We'll do A-frames. I just do everything. I haven't done a water tower yet. Recently, and that was the second time painting it, and that was fun, being 85 feet in the air, painting 3-foot tall letters. And you just get up there and you start to shake side to side because you're in a big 80-foot boom lift. This is out in Newburgh. I haven't really updated this recently. These are all kind of our McMinnville jobs. There's some of Mitch's work. Let's see, some fancy gold work for an art show. This was my first job I did in Portland. I did a little polar A-frame sign. I probably did this 4 years ago. Because when I got married, my wife's from up here, and we were living down in California. We'd come up for the summer every year. And so I was friends with the guy that runs this shop, and it's just up the street. If you look at this sign now, you'll still see it. It's super beat up. I need to paint a new one for him. Let's see, here's one of those old, this is an ice cream delivery truck for Salt and Straw, but this was down in Los Angeles. So that was kind of fun to do. They have a little satellite store down there.
Did you paint the whole exterior of the truck in this case?
No, they came to me with a red door and an army gray. I explained it as army gray because it was just like in between army green and gray exterior. It was a really funky looking truck. And we actually painted the white walls of the tires too. My friend found some actual white wall paint. I think it was just for white wall touch-ups because it didn't last too long. Let's see, here's the hardest sign I've ever painted. This was for Google down in Irvine. That was kind of a complicated one because I didn't use a projector. I had to just use rulers and measure it all out.
When did you start?
I started, I mean, I've done it on and off since high school, which was 2002 when I graduated. So I did some signs, some exterior signs for a skate shop that I skated for. And then on and off, I would do it because I've always done art, and people would ask me to do it. And then there's a little restaurant when I was going to college in 2008. My friend opened a restaurant, and he wanted me to just come in and paint some decorative flourishes. And I told him, your sign design that you're going to do looks terrible. So he said, okay, pitch me something. And so I pitched him something, and I ended up doing his next 4 restaurants. And in that time, I decided, like, hey, I'm just using like house paint from Home Depot. I got to find out how to do this for real. So I started looking up, and I found some old sign painting books and found a sign supply store, and was self-taught for the first bit.
At least you had the internet.
Yeah, I mean, in high school we didn't have much, but yeah, in the last 10 years it's been really nice.
Now, you said you didn't use a projector. Do you have something against using certain tools because of the history?
No. I mean, let's see, here's an example. This is a mural I did for my father-in-law. So I designed it all and I projected it because it was just so big to make a paper pattern. It would have just, this is like 60 feet by 20 feet pounce. That's mostly what I use is pounce. So it just depends on the size of the project and the, don't have my pounce. Well, anyways, there's a little wheel with serrated edge, and
It's kind of like a miniature spur.
Yeah,
So it's
and
like
so you'll,
like a Western spur. It's got little bitty spikes rolling along the line.
yep, you rolled it along the line that you've drawn, and it pokes little holes in your paper. And then you take a bag of charcoal, or you have a little box with a charcoal bag in it, and you hit it. You hit your paper pattern, and it leaves a little dotted line of charcoal where those little holes were. And so when you pull it away, you see a dotted line of all of your artwork. And historically, that comes from Michelangelo. I guess that's how he would do life drawings of all the people, and then he'd put them up on the Sistine Chapel wall or chapel ceiling, and pounce it up there, and that's how he got his drawings transferred. And that's how they look so good. So it's a time-tested technique, as they say. Oh yeah, no, I'm sure he could have just drawn it laying on his back up there. But that's probably the main way that. Oh, here we go. There's a pounce. There's an example of a sign that I used a little. I sketched it out and then pounced it, and then I was able to paint it on this. That's a really bad sign, but it was just a gift.
Have you ever, like, growing up and stuff, I had a lot of friends who were artists and stuff, and sometimes they would do things like graffiti and they went to jail and stuff. Have you ever, obviously not details, but have you ever thought about doing any kind of artwork that was not specifically sanctioned by anybody? A powerful place to put your art?
Yeah, I like to. I mean, for a while there in college, I got really into, because I went to college at BYU in Provo, Utah, and right by BYU, if you go down south, there's a huge train yard, and it's like the biggest train yard, well, other than Salt Lake. I mean, Utah in general is like where all the trains come to meet in the United States. And so down there, they'd have these trains, and you could look at these trains, and there'd be little like oil chalk drawings of characters and sayings, and they were drawn by like all the railroad workers, or there's just graffiti guys that had too many felonies and couldn't spray paint anymore, so they'd come up with a little drawing that they'd do, and you wouldn't get busted for those. So I used to draw those, and I love looking at the history of those, because you can see drawings of guys from like 1962 on an old train full of coal driving by. So that's kind of fun. As far as like painting on stuff, it just takes too much time, and I'd rather get paid for it if it's going to have letters. If I was going to paint something on like a building, I would rather paint. I'll show you something from my illustration. So this was our little picture that I put up for this event. But I love to do characters and watercolors and things like that. And I might do little guys like this. This was a job I did down in California. And these were all just free-handed off the top of my head, little vegetables and fruit characters. So I might do something like that.
You know, in the 80s, somebody took on Front Avenue and changed all the street signs one night to MLK, or no, to Malcolm X. Malcolm X, they took all the Front Avenue signs and changed them all to Malcolm X.
Wow.
Yeah, it was in the 80s. It was pretty wild.
That's awesome.
So how long do you feel like it took you to sort of get to the point where you felt like you're good at this?
That's a good question, because I'm still not 100% there yet, but I guess in bank account terms, probably after 5 years. I felt comfortable to charge what I felt I was worth, and people felt comfortable paying me what I was charging. So about 5 years of doing it. Now, in between, all those jobs in between, people were still satisfied, but I didn't get as many repeat clients.
Do you have like, so you were talking about some of these people that were kind of linked to an older era.
Uh-huh.
Do you have people, in the media, like, you know, mainstream artists and or just people that you know that are like your influences artistically that
Yeah.
maybe are going now? People you really like their work?
Yeah.
Even if it's like Sam Bateman or Joe or whatever.
Well, so when I was a kid, I grew up in a family where we weren't poor, but we didn't have any extra money or get old skateboards, and so that drove me to want to skateboard. Shows sparked something in me where him and his group of friends kind of was like a direction that inspired me. So he had friends up in San Francisco, and just in skateboarding culture in general, there was a lot of people like that would draw on either the older generation or the folk art, and a lot of those older artists, you know, the next 10 or 20 years older than me, helped inspire me to go the direction that I've gone.
Who is the dude or chick that did all of the cool help roll to like skeleton vulture things? Because I couldn't handle how cool they were when I was a little kid.
That's a good question. I actually skated for Bones at one point, and so I should know this. Ray Bones Rodriguez was the skater. I don't know. It's a good question. I'll have to look more into that. Maybe it says in here.
You know, when we started, the sign community was very generous because we didn't know what we were doing, and we would say, "Oh yeah, we can do that," and then we run somewhere, and people, our peers in the sign business, would help us. And the suppliers, the other sign guys would help us.
And you know, I find probably is, I don't know if it's unique to Portland, but it's. It might be unique to Portland. When I first moved here, I kept coming up. I got married to my wife about 7 years ago, right when I was getting into sign painting. It paid my way through college, and then we would come up to Portland, actually to McMinnville, but I would, you know, Portland was, and so I always wanted to see new signs or. Do you need anything else? Like, let us know. And it's something that, you know, when I moved to California, nobody did that. And it's something up here, there's definitely a culture of respect and brotherliness and respect.
They were probably a huge bridge between the old and the new.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because there's a...
And because they've been at it for a long time, and they've always been very open.
There's not too many people that bridge the gap between 1983 and now. I was born in 1983, but that's also the year that the plotter came out. I don't know if it was the Graphtec plotter or what plotter, but the vinyl plotter, to have a little computer. IBM and Apple would have it so you could type in letters and it would cut out letters for you.
They were $20,000.
But there's not very many sign painters between my age, I'm 32, and Pete and Lee's age, and they're in their 50s and 60s. And I find very few people in their 40s that paint signs or grew up painting signs. And you know, they're that bridge, and there were people that were a bridge for them, because there's little gaps throughout time when new sign techniques would come along. In the 60s, the big thing was plastic signs. They would have these like plastic cutout signs or big installed metal signs, and they were replacing a lot of the signs. But as technology continues to go forth, sign painting finds a way to come back. Just like that big sign that we looked at across the street, those letters coming back through, you know, there's got to be lead in our veins or something. I put this can of Sign Painter's One Shot. This is the main manufacturer of One Shot, and if you look on the back here, you guys can come and look at it. It is, well, maybe it doesn't say in here. Anyways, this is leaded One Shot. This has lead in it.
Is the new stuff still leaded?
No, they stopped doing lead probably about 1980, mid 80s, I think.
Is the lead paint nicer?
So the lead paint is a lot nicer. I mean, you can still shake it up. It paints really great. Just don't lick it or sand it. But any other questions?
What do you tell people who are on the fence about going vinyl to win them over?
You know, just you might walk them over to a vinyl sign that's been there for 5 years and is starting to crack, and say, hey, you know, like, look at this sign, and then you walk over to another, like a window that's painted in a building that's like hasn't been used for 20 years, and it's still there, and the paint's still holding strong, or the gold's still holding strong. You say, look, it's gonna, even if it does fade or crack, it's gonna do so in an elegant way, whereas vinyl, just the nature of it is just to peel away, and you can't read the letters anymore, and it just looks so bad. It really is. There's a purpose for it, but not in my life for the most part.
I mean, a sign and a mural, or do they just tend to blend together?
You know, that's a good question, and usually it comes down to, the question was the distinction between murals and signs, and in today's age, in talking about the unions, that was just to kind of like help the sign painters deal with all the city regulations. In Portland, you see huge murals, but you don't see huge signs. And it's the same way around the United States, and there's legislation that gets passed through cities and town halls and states to say, like, we don't want big signs, they're bad.
Oh, I kind of meant like creatively.
Creatively, that's the other thing. So you can do huge murals and you don't have to have a sign permit, but you also don't get paid nearly as much as if you painted a sign that big. Creatively, it's just a lot more fun to paint a mural most of the time, because you're usually doing it from your heart. You're not doing it for a commercial purpose, and it's nobody's going to critique you on your kerning or your letter formation.
You know, there's a great example of a crossing that bridge on 23rd Avenue, right when you come off the freeway. There's a Vespa dealership.
Okay.
They painted a beautiful mural on the side of the building, and
yeah, that's where you can use it to get away with advertising, is through pictorials.
Do
if you want.
ever do any restorative sign painting?
Yeah, so I could show examples, but I've done it. I've had to match where they've painted over half of an old ghost sign, and I had to paint the sign to kind of match the faded black where it fades to look. I've done that. I really like it. It's fun. I want to do that more. If you guys see any opportunities for that, let me know.
Is that ever an aesthetic that people have you like actively try to reproduce? Like,
I think
something new?
I think this day and age, like specifically the last 2 to 3 years with reclaimed everything and farm to wall everything, like it's definitely something like I get requests from companies that shouldn't be using reclaimed wood or having a distressed look, that they want their logo done on old barn wood with like holes in it. I'm like, why why do you want me to do that? Sometimes it looks great and it serves a good purpose. Sometimes it just looks really tacky and kitschy. So, all right, I think I'm going to call it to the end. You guys can talk to me after, but thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. We return on June 14th with Amy Dragon of Cascade Record Pressing with her talk, Getting Your Groove On, Considerations for Optimizing Your Vinyl Release. Cascade Record Pressing is the first large production automated record press at the turn of the century, small batch, hand pressed vinyl plant, Morrison Records of Seattle, Washington. It's going to be